All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the Middle East dialogue. At the outset, let me just extend a special thank you to all of you for joining us today, and also to the organizers of this important conference and the Policy Studies Organization. It's actually one of my favorite conferences of the year, partly because it's so intimate and I think so thoughtfully put together. So welcome. We have a terrific panel this afternoon. We've actually only got 2 speakers here at the moment. Technically, we have 3 speakers. Our third panelist may arrive, and if he does, we'll make sure to fit him in to the lineup. But at the outset, let me provide just a few brief introductory remarks about each of our distinguished speakers and give you a sense of who they are. Ahmed Zohny, to my right, is an associate professor of political science and international affairs at Coppin State University in Baltimore, Maryland. During his career, he served in various administrative and teaching capacities, including as dean, associate dean, department chair, director of the Institute of International Development and Strategic Studies, and academic director at Johns Hopkins University, the American University, the University of Maryland University College, Strayer University, and Southeastern University. Professor Zohny returned to academia after serving at the United States Department of State, USAID, and the World Bank. An economic, social, and political development expert of the Middle East and North Africa, Professor Zohny has served as a media analyst for events in Egypt and the Middle East. You can ask him all about the election taking place in Egypt. Professor Zohny is the author of a book titled The Politics, Economics, and Dynamics of Development Administration in Contemporary Egypt. His peer-reviewed scholarship has also been featured around the world. In addition to his academic career, Professor Zohny is also a distinguished international lawyer, and his talk today is titled An Assessment of President Donald Trump's Foreign Policy and Diplomacy After 1 Year in Office. Professor Zohny, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sascha. And for the audience, thank you very much for coming. And actually, my presentation is a very simple, moderate attempt to assess President Trump foreign policy and international behavior in the last year. So me and other scholars here in Washington at the Carnegie Institute and the Brookings Institute, they are trying hard to catch up with him and trying hard to interpret or understand what he's doing. But actually, President Trump is a newcomer to Washington and to politics, and he is the first president to win and be elected to the White House without major or significant financial contribution from any organized interest group. So actually he's the first president who used his own finances mostly to get or to earn this job. So actually his behavior, to be fair to him, his behavior has to be different from any other previous president or presidents who came to power based on significant contribution and support either from organized interest groups or from the party, political party. So he's neither. He did not get much significant contribution from any organized interest groups, maybe 30 million from the NRA, okay, which is not really much. And also his political party really did not support him the way other presidents actually got support from the party. So actually with this context, actually we have to try to understand him as much as we can, okay? So actually my focus here is I'm trying to get into perspective to how President Trump conducted foreign policy and diplomacy in the last year. So actually, Dr. Henry Kissinger text one of the national bestsellers book about diplomacy. He says that we are the only country in the world which our foreign policy behavior was very much inconsistent, okay, in the international affairs. We are the only country which our democratic values were the basis for our international affairs, okay? And also we are the only country who, in our contemporary history, particularly after World War II, who give ourselves the right to intervene in other countries' international affairs. Okay, so actually these two, this inconsistency between the two positions, okay, no country has been more reluctant to engage itself abroad, even when undertaking alliance and commitment of unprecedented reach and scope in Europe, North America, the Far East, the Middle East, as USA. Okay, so actually this one of the major themes in Dr. Henry Kissinger approach. Let me go to very simple concept is that the head of state in any political system, whether the president or the prime minister, is the chief diplomat, okay? The chief diplomat, and of course, the foreign minister or the secretary of state is the person or officer in charge of the day-to-day operation. So actually, the influence of the head of state on the secretary of state is huge, okay? But also the secretary of state, while conducting his day-to-day operation of international affairs, he is influenced and sometimes interrupted by other cabinet members, such as the Secretary of Defense, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA. So actually, the Secretary of State really job is very complicated, and also it became more complicated gradually after World War II, with the end of with the start of the decolonization, and after that, the fall down of the Soviet Union. After that, the globalization. After that, the era of the information age, digital, social media, okay? And also there are other actors are proved to be influential in international relations, like NGOs, okay? The transnational organizations, okay, which actually they are competing now with states, okay, particularly the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, even it is not member of the UN, it has observer status, but it is active in international relations, and the social media made terrorist organizations and radical violent organizations also are actors in international affairs. So actually, the job of the Secretary of State now is very complicated. There is one personal issue which I want to talk about it. When President Trump elected Mr. Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, I was very pleased because historically in this country, business leaders, they played very important role in international affairs. Since FDR, he trusted business leaders and he sent them to missions to the Middle East. Okay, so there is something called international business diplomacy, which is very interesting part of the conduct of international relations. And actually, when I was in Egypt, I was assigned by, when I was working for the Egyptian government this time, assigned by President Sadat to accompany the president of Mobil Oil Corporation in this time in 1974, when he arrived to Egypt on a special mission to meet President Sadat. I was representing the Egyptian government in this time to be part of the team who worked with him. So actually, his name is Mr. Tavo Larias. He was the president of Mobil Oil Corporation. Okay, so in this time, President Nixon, he sent him to open Egypt. See, he did not send the Secretary of State in this time. He sent President of Mobil Oil Corporation because Mobil Oil Corporation was very respected in Egypt. They sponsored many programs of social responsibility in Egypt for education, for health. Okay, so actually after that, Dr. Henry Kissinger came to Egypt, and after that, the U.S. Embassy opened in Egypt, reopened after, you know, that it was after 1976 war, Nasser broke a diplomatic relationship. So actually, business leaders, they are more proficient than bureaucrats, with all my due respect, in the State Department and other. Why? Because they act in different way. You know, they are faster, they are more informal, and so on. So actually, when President Trump, he selected Rex, I said, this is a very good move. He's president of Exxon Mobil, you know what I mean? He is a globalist. Okay, he will handle very well his job, but apparently it didn't work out this way. A globalist, I reviewed very carefully when I was searching this paper. All his public statements were very good. Rex, really, very, very professional. And in many times he contradicts what his boss said on sending to it, and here's the Secretary of State trying to, like, in one hand, Mr. Trump, he sent many tweets to the Middle East. I'm focusing now on the Middle East, but also other tweets and other regions has spillover effects on the Middle East. But Secretary Rex, after bad tweet, he'll come up with public statement, either through him directly or through the spokesperson of the State Department. So actually, he was doing his job. He viewed our role as from global perspective. But unfortunately, our president, his slogan is America first, a nationalist. So actually, nationalist and America first will not square well with actually global. So I was expecting maybe 2 weeks prior to firing the Secretary of State that this will happen. Why? Because absolutely he and the president will go in different directions. But actually, it will be fair also to look at President Trump from the business perspective, okay? He doesn't have any experience in the government in Washington, okay? He was successful businessman, corporate executive, and actually all his behavior since he started like typical CEO of a corporation who makes decisions to prop up the value of the stock of his corporation in the short run. When you attend any corporate annual meeting, you'll find the first statement by the CEO that my first priority is to improve the value of the stock. So actually, he's very much behaving as a CEO of a corporation. So all his quick tweet-like behavior policies are very much reflect behavior of a successful CEO who is looking to the short run or quick profit for his company. This, of course, doesn't apply to foreign affairs in many cases, okay? Also, the second issue here is that he's particularly dealing with the Middle East. He came with perception or worldview that everything President Obama did was wrong in the Middle East. Okay, everything was wrong. So actually he's coming, anything is affiliated with President Obama, he perceived it as wrong. So consequently, he is very much trying to start from scratch. And sometimes this is very difficult, okay, to start from scratch. However, let me focus a little bit. Okay, let me, here, the conceptual framework here, no, let me go to the issue of national interest. The national interest, according to respectable scholars, are 4 P's. 4 P's. Perception, right? Peace, priorities, and power. Okay, those are the 4 P's of national interest. And I add to them the 5 P, personality of the president. Personality of the president. And for the first time in the history, we got someone in the House, at the White House, who was successful entertainer. He was successful entertainer, TV entertainer for 10 years, right? He has 10 years program with NBC. He did very well. I used to watch it because it was funny, it was forceful, you know what I mean? And he has large audience. This one thing. Also, we have the first time president who views our other actors in terms of their looks, their appearance, how they influence the media, how they talk. Okay, he is big mouth, of course, President Trump. Okay, big mouth. He talk fast. He's entertainer. He's well trained to be entertainer. So actually, he wants everyone around him, particularly cabinet members, to be like him. So one of the reasons he criticized former Secretary of State Rixet, he spoke very slowly. He spoke, is this really, Is this really a reason to fire him? Because he spoke very slowly. The guy is coming from one of the largest multinational corporations, successful multinational corporations in the history of this country. Also, he just, to the best of my knowledge, he convinced it, he used his influence as a formal president of the corporation to invest 50 billion in the U.S. economy. You know that. He announced it in the State of the Union. See what I mean? After that, he's criticizing him because he is slow. He talks slowly. See what I mean? So actually, but very interesting is that when we look at his behavior in the White House, many of us can say, if I am from him, I really should be careful. Slow down a little bit. He is moving toward impeachment, right? His public polls are down so far, except Fox News, right? Fox News public polls always giving him more score, but the rest public polls are down. Okay, the staff of the White House, the turnover is very high. Okay, and all this happening, everyone may say, if I'm in his situation, I should really slow down. But apparently, no. He's gaining more confidence in enjoying, teasing this, mocking that, damaging. You know what I mean? So actually, we are in a situation which actually we didn't. I studied diplomacy in the last 30 years almost, okay, from Morgan Thau to here and there, good, I would see, I'm not able to really, but finally I told myself he's not worth to spend time in trying to, you know what I mean? Trying to relate his behavior to any theory I know. You know what I mean? So apparently, more competent political scientist after the end of his first term or second term, he or she will be able to do that. But the serious situation is that he is dealing with very important issues in a very rational way. You know, very rational way, like issue of North Korea. You know, you cannot antagonize North Korean leader who already possess nuclear power. You know what I mean? You cannot too much antagonize him. You know what I mean? Because I can look from the side of the other person, rocket man. Their culture is different. If he felt insulted in front of his people, he may act. And our military bases in South Korea, 25 miles from his capital. We have a large military presence in Japan. Guam, just is wrong. Again, while President Obama and the entire international community, including our Europe allies and the 4 other permanent members of the Security Council, they agreed that the Palestinian Arab problem, okay, Palestinian-Israeli problem should be dealt with the goal of reaching 2 states. You know what I mean? Okay, 2 states solution. The 4 other members of the Security Council, our allies, 128 countries member of the UN, okay, and even our allies like Canada, down under, they abstained from voting in the UN. You know what I mean? It looks very bad when the leader of the most powerful nation in the United Nations, that 128 countries, they vote against moving Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to to the other place, Jerusalem. In one tweet, he antagonized maybe 2 million Muslims in the world. Because for one reason, the Shiite and Sunni Muslims, there are many, they disagree on many issues, the Shia and Muslim, but both of them agree on one issue, Jerusalem. You know what I mean? It has to be, not all of it, it has to be Palestinian, but at least half of it, East Jerusalem, where the mosque is there, and also the Christian Bethlehem church is there, and the West Jerusalem to be for the Jewish state. This is actually the Muslims, both Shia and Sunni, finally they said this is the right way to end this conflict. Now here again, he did that. You know what I mean? A unilateral act immediately after 2 hours from this demonstration in Jerusalem. 2 small young adult people died, and the entire social media. I looked at the social media in Egypt. Oh, the entire, you know what I mean? So actually, this is, of course, not right. But again here, let me go to the interface between domestic policy and foreign policy. There's always anyone in this position, or any president or prime minister, has to look at both domestic politics and foreign politics. So make sure that his foreign policy and diplomacy is not antagonizing a powerful interest group or antagonizing his political party. Apparently, President Trump, particularly his move on the capital of Israel, was very well squared, well received by very powerful interest group here, which is AIPAC. Okay, it's very good. I'm talking about his own personal, okay, but okay, with his party, I believe, is very much in favor of a peace process, which will end with two-state situation. Let me carefully, very quickly, study relationship between him and his party in the last year. Apparently, they they gave up that Trump will do what Trump wants. So actually, his political leaders of his political party, the speaker and the most leaders in the Congress, they ended up that will not be able to change his personality. So actually, Trump is Trump. He will continue do what he is doing the way he wants. But also, in the meantime, they said, let us do the business of the country. So apparently, they succeeded in passing, or he helped them to pass many good piece of laws, legislation in his first year. First, the tax law passed, which several decades, many presidents couldn't do it. Okay. Second, he appointed conservative judge to the Supreme Court, and many federal judges, conservative, to the federal benches. Okay, this is very good. Okay, for the GOP are happy with that. Okay, for President Trump, he's happy that one of the unintended consequences of his unpredictable foreign policy, okay, is that the stock market went up, Stock market went up with the international consequences, means that more confidence of foreign investors in the U.S. economy, right? This one positive thing. Second, rate of unemployment is low, okay, or the economy is actually moving up. So actually, he is enjoying those advantages. Let us go quickly to his foreign policy goals. Oh. Okay, this and the other one, actually four. He wants his foreign policy goal to the Middle East to end ISIS. This what was the first foreign policy goal in the Middle East. Second, to work with partners in the Middle East, okay, to actually prepare the sour relationship between the U.S. and partners like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, because under President Obama, he actually, by the time he finished the second term and the Arab Spring happened, so actually it was not good. President Obama, he pushed for democracy, human rights issue, which for dictatorship countries in the Middle East were not happy of that. So he's back on track of this, building partnership with countries, influential countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, and continue with Qatar. The third principle is putting an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, or to provide comprehensive peace. So actually, in the first one, yes, he succeeded. He succeeded means that by instructing U.S. military forces or empowering them to act in the battlefield without coming back to Washington. Actually, this was very good. So almost 93% of the territories taken by ISIS now freed. But the very interesting part is that he conducted all this campaign and paid by King Salman of Saudi Arabia. When he visited him in Riyadh, he asked him for $40 million to finance the campaign against ISIS. So actually, for the first time, the president was able to achieve foreign policy goals at the expense of other country. Okay, this is very good. The issue of the peace between Palestinian, Arab, Muslims, and Israel, he failed, from my point of view, for simply making this statement. The timing was not right. Arab countries now, many of them are busy with fighting ISIS, particularly after ISIS fighters left Syria and Iraq. They went to Libya, Egypt, Yemen, you know what I mean? So all of them, Arab countries, are busy for internal security reasons, and their economy is jammed. So actually, the timing was good, even not in favor of even Tel Aviv. The timing was not good. Israel, and I'm following the peace movement in Israel, they were not happy, and my colleague will talk about that after that. Okay, where we are now, okay? But actually, we have to give him a credit that President Obama, he did not, foreign policy and diplomacy, avoided siding any side in the Middle East. You know what I mean? He didn't want side because the internal division, the dynamics of the internal division between Shia and Sunni and Kurds and here, it's very complicated. So he tried to be above the internal division. He did not take a clear-cut, black and white policy, foreign policy toward the Middle East or any side in the Middle East. By contrast, the President Obama, Trump foreign policy was very much clear-cut. He sided Sunni Muslim against Shiite. Okay, a clear-cut. You know what I mean? A clear-cut. Okay, he attacked the Arab Spring. Okay, he attacked, he said the Arab Spring was something bad to happen in the Middle East. Okay, so actually, this is a difference between the two presidents. He apparently succeeded in the short run, that pulling back the major Arab countries toward us, particularly the rich country, Saudi Arabia. Okay, but again, he antagonized Egypt because he refused to recognize Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist state. And this is, again, Sisi and the Egyptian government is not happy with this situation. But whether really I should undermine Obama effort against ISIS, I say no, because Obama team, they said that what the plan we started, it will pay off in 2017. They started already incremental military and intelligence operation, okay, in 2015, and they said it will end 2017. And apparently, Trump, the candidate for the president, he always says that I do have secret plan to defeat ISIS. Apparently, he did not have any secret plan, but he continued use Obama plan. Okay, so actually this is where we are. Apparently, the last year ended, but the next year really, I am not optimistic about really what will happen the next year in the Middle East, particularly if President Trump, he continue act the way he is acting. And in fact, leaders of the Middle East, likewise, our allies in Europe, they start to look at President Trump in a practical way, a pragmatic way. They don't pay much attention to his daily tweets. And they knew that after a while, the political staff, appointees who are heading now foreign policy, very soon they will learn Washington tricks, and they are the one who will be driving foreign policy and diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Professor Zohny, thank you so much for that thoughtful overview of Trump's first year in office. It's hard to believe it's only been 1 year. And I think it's probably best if we hold the questions until afterwards. Yes. And I'm sure there are many questions and comments. Let me offer a brief introduction for our next speaker as he's getting his presentation pulled up. Our next speaker is Dr. Mitchell Bard. He is an American foreign policy analyst, editor, and author who specializes in U.S. Middle East policy. He's currently the executive director of the American-Israeli Cooperative Enterprise and the director of the Jewish Virtual Library. Dr. Bard is the author or editor of 24 books, and his work has been published in academic journals and newspapers. He's a former editor of the Near East Report, the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, weekly newsletter on U.S. Middle East policy. Before working for AIPAC, he was a polling analyst for George H.W. Bush for President Survey Research Group during the 1988 presidential election. He's been interviewed on Fox News, MSNBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, and many other media outlets. Dr. Bard's talk today is titled, Trump's Recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's Capital, a Step Forward or Backward for Peace. Dr. Bard?
Thank you. I don't need the microphone. Thanks very much. You don't have to use it for the camera. Sorry, what? The microphone's going to be... Oh, I need the microphone? Oh, okay. Well, first of all, the U.S. Congress voted overwhelmingly in 1995 that Jerusalem should be the capital, recognized as the capital of the State of Israel, and the U.S. Embassy should be moved there. The anomaly was that Jerusalem is the only place, the only capital in the entire world that the United States did not recognize as the capital, as the country that chose it. The State Department largely was responsible over these last 22 years in trying to prevent the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. This is one of the reasons why Rex Tillerson is the former Secretary of State, because he was among those who opposed the recognition. The main argument had been that there would be an apocalypse in the Middle East if the United States recognized Jerusalem and moved its embassy, that the entire Muslim world would be in an uproar, the Middle East would go up in flames, our embassies would be attacked, there would be another intifada in the Palestinian territories, and of course, none of that happened, which would have been predictable by most people, but the State Department has had this fear of the Arab street, of the Muslim world, going back to the earliest days of the 1930s and 40s, when they became more active in the region and became increasingly concerned that any action that we made that was supportive of the State of Israel would necessarily lead to some diminution of support among the Arab states, something that's been proven untrue over the entire course of U.S. Middle East history, but hasn't changed State Department Arabist thinking to the present day. Now, if you think about what are the prerequisites for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, it's not the exhaustive list, but these are the principal ones. One, that there should be face-to-face negotiations between the parties, that there needs to be, at the end of the discussions, an agreement that conflict will be over, that there should be the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, there should be an end to all terror and incitement. There has to be a settlement to the question of Jerusalem. There must be some form of territorial compromise. Palestinian and Jewish refugee issue has to be resolved. And there have to be some security guarantees for whatever the future arrangement is. And if we have time, hopefully I can get through all of these prerequisites, but our focus, at least initially, is on Jerusalem. Now, what's interesting about Jerusalem, many interesting things, obviously, in history, but in terms of politics, how does a city normally grow? Well, you start with the inner part of the city, and it grows gradually outward. Now, in the case of Jerusalem, it's grown in the exact opposite direction because of a political decision by the Israeli governments over the years that they would start from the outside and gradually grow the city inward. Now, looking at it in less abstract terms, if you look at a map, so the green line is the line of the 67 borders, more accurately, the 49 armistice lines. And this blue line is what you might call Greater Jerusalem, so that now Jerusalem is really considered everything within that blue line. Now, in terms of the discussions about the future of a Palestinian state, the Palestinian argument, demand, is that East Jerusalem should be the capital of a Palestinian state. And basically, this is more or less what it would look like. The green is more or less the contours of East Jerusalem. The blue is what's predominantly West Jerusalem and Israeli, the predominantly Jewish part of Israeli Jerusalem. And that little box is the Old City. To make it a little bit more specific, if you look at the map today, whatever color this is, brown, I guess, are the Israeli Jewish predominant areas, and the more purplish ones are the more Palestinian areas. And what you can see, to go back to my original drawings, is that the Israelis created settlements, what the rest of the world calls settlements and Israel would call Jewish communities, along the outside of Jerusalem. So here was the 67 borders, but Israel then began building out here these communities with the intention, as I showed in that earlier drawing, of moving this way, filling in all of this area with the Jewish population so that this entire area would now be Jewish Israeli Jerusalem. Just another version of the same thing. The colors may be a little easier to see, where you have, again, the blue is the predominantly Israeli areas, mostly within the 67 borders. The settlements in the bluish color, which were built again outside the municipal boundaries of 67 with the intention of filling them in. And then the predominantly Arab areas of East Jerusalem and other parts of Jerusalem in this brownish area. So why do we even pay any attention to Palestinian claims to Jerusalem? On what basis the Palestinians have for saying that that should be their capital? Well, one thing is they say that the land is Palestinian. Well, the fact is, at best, Palestinians have been in the land for 1,000 years, and most came in the late 2000 or in the early 20th century. The majority of the population in Jerusalem since the mid-19th century has been Jewish. They argue it's always been the capital of Palestine. Well, again, historically, Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish state going back 3,000 years. It's never been the capital of an Arab state, a Muslim state in the entire history of human civilization. In fact, Jerusalem, for the most of the Muslim Empire period, was a backwater that was largely neglected and ignored. Jerusalem's central to Islam is another argument that they make. Well, not all of Jerusalem is actually central to Islam. It's primarily the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's holy to all Muslims. It's not specifically holy or special to Palestinians. The whole Muslim world has as much claim to Jerusalem as the Palestinians do. They make the case that it's a non-negotiable demand. They must get Jerusalem, or there can be no agreement. Well, you can't always get what you want, as the Rolling Stones would say. Basically, there's no real legitimacy to the demand. It's simply something they want. They argue also that there can't be any other capital of Palestine other than Jerusalem. Well, strangely enough, this guy named Abu Mazen, also known as Mahmoud Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority, reached an agreement with Yossi Beilin, a leader of the Labor Party, as far back as 1995, where he had agreed to the idea of creating a capital for the state of Palestine in a town called Abu Dis. And the year after, they even built the parliament building. It's still there. It's in disrepair now, but they built their parliament with the expectation that that could be the capital of Palestine. Now, Abu Dis, for those of you who may not know the geography, is this little area right here. Again, I'm sorry, these maps are all done by different people, so the colors are all different. But if you look at the red line here, this is basically the line of Greater Jerusalem today, what the Israelis would claim to be the capital, what they would want to maintain as their united capital. And again, you can see sort of these outer parts of the city where Israel has built settlements. Ma'ale Adumim is the biggest one, with about 40,000 citizens. And the plan had been to build, again, to fill in all of the gaps between these outer settlements. And Abu Dis is just literally over the 67 border. Today, there's a wall around part of Jerusalem, and Abu Dis is just on the other side of the wall. If you go to that part of Jerusalem, you can look over the wall and you can see that parliament building I showed a minute ago. So in the case of an agreement, that's most likely the place where a Palestinian state would have its capital. And what was important about Trump's decision was, for all these prerequisites for peace, it took Jerusalem off the table. That from Israel's perspective, certainly this is what they said all along, that they weren't going to compromise on the unity of Jerusalem, and that if the Palestinians really expect to have any kind of chance for an independent state, they have to accept the fact that they're not going to get Jerusalem, they're not going to get the old city, and that if they want to have a capital, it would be in a place like Abu Dis, which has certain merits to it. On the one hand, the Palestinians can say our capital is in Jerusalem, because Abu Dis is basically within the municipal boundaries. And the Israelis at the same time can say, our capital is in Jerusalem. Well, it's not ideal because the Palestinians want all of Jerusalem or all of East Jerusalem. They're not content just with Abu Dis. And from Israel's perspective, it wouldn't be ideal either because Abu Dis, as you saw on the map, is literally a few steps away from the center of Jerusalem. And so from their perspective, there's a security component. But once you've taken that off the table, then you have other issues which, for the most part, have been, to some degree, more closely resolved. But in order to get anywhere, you have to first have face-to-face negotiations. And Mahmoud Abbas has refused to talk to the Israelis since 2008. He had the most pro-Palestinian president in history, in Barack Obama, trying to push the Israelis more in his direction, and yet he refused to negotiate with Netanyahu. And he can't negotiate with the United States, he can't negotiate with the United Nations, he can't negotiate with anyone else if he hopes to get a peace agreement. But what he has tried to do, despite that, is to use the world, the international community, the UN, the EU, to try to convince them to impose a solution on Israel. And it's simply not going to work, in part because of the President of the United States. Not only Donald Trump, but his predecessors would never go along with any kind of diktat from the United Nations or from the EU. And so it leaves the Palestinians, again, with the only option of face-to-face talks. Second prerequisite was an agreement to end the conflict. In the negotiations in 2000 between Ehud Barak, Yasser Arafat, and President Clinton at Camp David, Dennis Ross, the main peace negotiator for the United States, said that besides all the other disagreements they had in that negotiation, Arafat made it clear that he would not agree to end the conflict even if they reached an agreement on all the other issues. And without ending the conflict, there's no chance that the Israelis are going to ever sign an agreement. Recognition of Israel as a Jewish state actually is a relatively new demand. Prior to Netanyahu, other prime ministers didn't make this as a demand. Netanyahu's made the case that unless the Palestinians demonstrate that they're willing to acknowledge that the Jewish people have a right to a state, that they have the right to self-determination in their homeland, that's an indication that they really don't accept the right of the Jews to have a state or are willing to accept in any kind of long-term way a Jewish state living in peace beside the Palestinian state. I think in all likelihood this is not a serious concern. If negotiations on all the other issues were to move forward, this isn't going to be the deal breaker, whether the Palestinians make some sort of statement to the effect that they recognize Israel as a Jewish state. But for the time being, it's a talking point under the Netanyahu government. In order to make peace, there has to be an end to terror and incitement. I believe that probably the most important event in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, maybe in the last half century, if not more, is the Gaza disengagement. In 2005, you had the test of the hypothesis that we'd been hearing incessantly up to that point, which was that you needed to trade land for peace. So that if Israel would just make territorial concessions, then they would have peace with the Palestinians. So in 2005, Israel withdrew all 9,000 citizens from Gaza, withdrew every Israeli soldier, And the expectation was that would bring about peace. And if you think about what a difference the situation would have made if that had happened. You know, the Israelis dismantled all of the settlements that were in the Gaza Strip with the expectation that the Palestinians said they were going to use those areas to build high-rise apartments for the refugees and take them out of the camps and put them in permanent housing. The Israelis left behind a bunch of greenhouses, which was a multi-million-dollar trade economy that they handed over to the Palestinians. They expected that the Palestinians would take advantage of now their freedom in Gaza to create the infrastructure for a state and to keep the peace. Now, if all of those things would have happened, it's hard to imagine today Israelis not saying, well, look, after 12 years, we saw how the Palestinians have kept the peace after we gave up this territory. We can certainly consider making concessions on the West Bank because look how it turned out in Gaza. We got peace in exchange for land. Well, of course, that's not what happened. The Palestinians didn't build a single house for a single refugee, despite getting billions of dollars in aid on those lands they got from the settlers. Instead of using those greenhouses to build a multi-billion-dollar trade export economy for Gaza, they torched them. The ones that they didn't burn down, they used as Hamas training camps. Instead of peace, they fired more than 10,000 rockets into Israel. They built terror tunnels to try to infiltrate Israel. Instead of building the infrastructure for a state, they had a coup d'etat, leading Hamas to take over from the Palestinian Authority. And all of this, the Israelis saw as evidence that giving up land was not going to give them any peace. And so you had the entire Israeli population shift to the right. You know, you don't see peace now demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of Israelis calling for an immediate end of the occupation. You don't see great movement in the political parties calling for any kind of territorial compromise because there's just no support for it today in Israel because of what happened in Gaza. In addition to that, you have the continuing terrorism that goes on today through the West Bank. You have what's been referred to as the pay-to-slay policy, where the Palestinian Authority gives salaries to Palestinians who have been jailed in Israel for terrorist crimes, or to quote-unquote martyrs' families, people who were suicide bombers. Their families get paid salaries by the Palestinian Authority today. And most of those salaries are higher, by the way, than what Palestinians can make in normal jobs working in the West Bank. And it's an encouragement for a Palestinian to go out and attack an Israeli because they know they're going to get paid more doing that than if they were to try to get a job in the West Bank. Just yesterday, the government, Congress, passed the budget. I don't know if you're aware, but one of the things tucked into that 300, 600, however many page budget is the Tailor Force Act, which is named after an American soldier who was on a vacation visiting Israel, was stabbed to death by a Palestinian terrorist. As a result of that, this act was named after him, and it calls for a reduction in aid to the Palestinian Authority unless they end the pay-to-slay policy. Territorial compromise is necessary if there's going to be a peace agreement. Well, the last major initiative by Israel was Ehud Olmert in 2008. He had more than 30 negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas, offered 93.7% of the West Bank with a 5.8% land swap. Abbas turned it down. Israel has said on various occasions it's prepared to evacuate all but the consensus settlements, which I'll mention in a second. The Palestinians have demanded that Israel freeze settlements, but Israel has no obligation to do so. Under the Oslo Agreements, they don't have to freeze settlements. You can say, well, they should. It would be wise if they did. It's illegal that they expand them, but Israel feels no obligation to do so. The only way you're going to end settlement expansion is by reaching a peace agreement. Because if you look at the history, I would argue that Arafat and Abbas are really the fathers of the settlements, not Ariel Sharon or Menachem Begin or anyone else. Why do I say that? Well, let's look at the evidence of whether settlements are really the obstacles to peace. From 1949 to 1967, Jordan occupied the West Bank, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and how many settlers were there? 0. Was there peace? No, there was none. And what's even more interesting is during that entire 19 years, the Palestinians who claim that this land goes back to time immemorial, that they were Canaanites' descendants, that they can't live without a Palestinian state, never once did they demand the creation of a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank when it was under the control of Jordan and Egypt. In 1977 through 79, during the negotiations between Israel and Egypt, Menachem Begin offered the Palestinians autonomy. Wasn't perfect by any means. It wasn't the establishment of a Palestinian state, but it was giving Palestinians greater control over their lives, and I would argue it would have been very difficult for Israel to prevent the Palestinian autonomy from turning into a state. They turned it down. At the time, how many Jews were there? 12,000. Then you get up to the Oslo Agreement, where for the first time the Palestinians recognized the state of Israel. Israel recognized the PLO. At that time, there were 136,000 Jews in the West Bank. The expectation was that, according to the agreement, within 5 years, a Palestinian state, actually a Palestinian entity, Yitzhak Rabin never supported the creation of a Palestinian state, a Palestinian entity would have been created within 5 years. But over those 5 years, you had settlements being built from the Palestinian perspective, breaking the Oslo Agreement, again, although it didn't say they couldn't. And you had an escalation of violence and terrorism against Israelis that led to the collapse of Oslo. And at that time, there were 172,000 Jews in the West Bank. Now you move to 2000, when you had the negotiation between Barak, Clinton, and Arafat. The Israelis offered to give up 97% of the West Bank, evacuate over 100 settlements, create some sort of a status for the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and Arafat said no. Not only did he say no, he didn't even offer a counter proposal. He didn't say, I want 99.999% of the West Bank. He simply said, no deal. At that time, there were 2,000 Jews. Then another 8 years goes by before Abbas gets involved in the negotiations that I just mentioned with Olmert. He rejects the plan. Now there are 276,000 Jews. For the last 10 years, as I said, Abbas has refused to negotiate with the Israelis. Has that done the Palestinians any good? Well, it hasn't gotten them a Palestinian state. And what has it done for the West Bank? Now there are 435,000. Depending on who you listen to, that number will go up exponentially the longer the Palestinians refuse to negotiate. Now, what does it look like in terms of the map? This just gives you a sense of where the Israeli settlements now spread around the West Bank. Nevertheless, it is possible to reach an agreement in which many of the settlements would be evacuated at some point. There are 5 main what are called consensus settlements in Israel, consensus blocks, which even the Palestinians agreed would be a part of Israel in the case of a future agreement. Today, about 58% of the Jews live in these 5 main blocks. That percentage has gone down considerably because of the growth in the population that I just showed you on the last slide. There are more than 100 settlements today, but they only occupy about 1.5% of the West Bank. So in terms of territory, it's not that difficult to make a territorial compromise. But now, because of the change in the demography of the West Bank, even if a third of the Israelis were to move from outer settlements into these 5 blocks, which was the expectation in the Clinton plan, 120,000 Jews would still need to be evacuated. And given what happened when Israel evacuated just 9,000 from Gaza, it's really hard to imagine Israel evacuating over 100,000 Jews from the West Bank. Just to give you an idea of what the blocks look like, these are the troublesome blocks, especially Ariel, because it juts out about 15 kilometers or 15 miles into the West Bank, so it sort of interrupts the contiguity. The other settlements are more along the outer rim of the 67 borders. if there's going to be a Palestinian state, this is basically the conception of what it was going to look like, or what some people still think it might look like, that you would incorporate these settlement blocks, but the rest would be the Palestinian territories, just another similar kind of map, that basically the Palestinian state would look sort of like a kidney shape, incorporating, again, those settlement blocks. This is the way it would connect with Gaza. There's different ideas about how it would connect with Gaza, whether it be some sort of a nonstop railroad or overhead highway. But basically, the idea is this would be what a Palestinian state would look like. Now, it's changed somewhat since 2000 because of the demography and also the change in the Israeli government, which I'll get to in a second at the end when it comes to security. But one of the other prerequisites for peace involves compensation for the refugees. The Israelis have made quite clear they're never going to accept the quote-unquote right of return. According to the Palestinians, there's 5 million Palestinian refugees. If 5 million Palestinians moved to Israel, basically that would turn Israel into a Palestinian state, and the Palestinians would go from no states to 2 states, one that used to be Israel and one that is now in the West Bank. So no Israeli leader would ever accept it, and even the Palestinians themselves have said that they recognize that this is a non-starter for public consumption. They continue to say they want the right of return, but as we found out from Pali leaks, the leak of Palestinian negotiating documents, even Abbas was prepared to accept the compromise, where Israel has agreed to accept something like 100,000 Palestinian refugees on a humanitarian basis. There would be an international compensation fund set up for the refugees. That would be very easy. I'm sure the Europeans would fall all over themselves to provide money to Palestinian refugees. Israel is increasingly focused on getting compensation for the Jewish refugees. More than 500,000 Jews were forced to leave the Arab countries after independence, and there's a movement that's grown over the years demanding compensation for them, but in all likelihood that wouldn't hold up an agreement with the Palestinians. Lastly, there's a need for security guarantees. After what happened in Gaza, as I said, the Israeli population has moved to the right in terms of its political views. There's a fear that the West Bank would turn into Hamastan, that is, Hamas could easily take over the West Bank. It's trying on a daily basis to do so. In fact, one of the oddities about the talk about a Fatah-Hamas reconciliation is that would have made it even easier for Hamas to possibly take over the West Bank. But since that fell apart, Hamas still has a problem trying to take over the West Bank. And it's one of the main reasons that the Palestinians and the Israelis cooperate in security areas, even though Abbas will complain all the time and say he's going to cut off relations with Israel. He maintains military cooperation or security cooperation, mainly to save his own life and protect him from a Hamas takeover. The Israelis demand the demilitarization of a Palestinian state. I think that's a pretty unreasonable demand on the part of the Israelis. The Zionists would have never accepted a demilitarized Jewish state. It's hard to imagine that the Palestinians would accept that, but it's one of the expectations. At some point, Hamas is going to have to be destroyed in Gaza if there's going to be a peace that involves both Gaza and the West Bank, because Hamas has an ideology which is openly calling for the destruction of Israel. So long as that's the policy in Gaza, there can't be a unified Palestinian state of both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And since Netanyahu came to power, there's an increasing emphasis on keeping the Jordan Valley as part of Israel. So one difference between those earlier maps of a Palestinian state and the current one has to do with keeping the Jordan Valley. Again, from Israel's perspective, when they talk about security, they look at what the Palestinians could do just firing Katyusha rockets or Qassam rockets. When they fire them from Gaza, most of them end up falling in the desert harmlessly. But if they were to start firing rockets from a state in the West Bank, they could easily hit Ben Gurion Airport, the capital of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, all of the major population centers. So any territorial compromise involves very severe security risks for Israel. Even if in the short term an agreement could be reached, they have to worry about the long term as well. And so partly to protect that long term, the Netanyahu government has said that any agreement would require Israel to hold on to the Jordan Valley, which basically would give Israel a position surrounding the Palestinian Authority, or at least surrounding part of the Palestinian state. This map was the plan of Yigal Allon back in the 1960s and 70s when they first talked about the idea of giving the Palestinians some sort of territorial control. So basically, if you look at the reality today, I think we're headed for what I call the no-state solution. It's simply unlikely in the foreseeable future to reach any kind of a two-state agreement. There's no Palestinian Sadat who's willing to make an agreement and make the kind of concessions that any Israeli government would be prepared to accept. There's the growing Islamization of the conflict, which makes it increasingly difficult to see any kind of a solution, as long as you have radical Islamists like Hamas who say, we don't care what the borders of Israel are, they're unacceptable. We can't accept the idea of a Jewish state anywhere in the Middle East. The fact that Hamas and Fatah are having their own dysfunction. You can't negotiate a settlement between Israel and Palestinians if there is no one Palestinian leader who can negotiate on the part of both Gazans and the West Bank. A major change is the misperception of the centrality of the issue. For years and years, you heard that the Palestinian issue was the central issue in the Middle East conflict. It was the key to stability in the region. Now almost nobody believes this. It was never true in the first place, but clearly the Palestinian issue has nothing to do with the Syrian civil war, with the Shiite-Sunni conflicts, with Iran, Iraq, with Yemen, with most of the instability in the region. And the fact of the matter is the Palestinians are coming to the realization that most of the Arab world really doesn't care that much about them and isn't willing to place their own interests behind those of their own interests. As I said, Israel's insecurity is a problem. Israeli political constraints are a problem. The fact that the government currently relies on right-wing parties to stay in power. It's not going to be a one-state solution. Israel's not going to annex the territories. Even the most right-wing prime ministers, whether it's Netanyahu, Sharon, Begin, none of them have been willing to annex the territories because they know that would be the end of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. And finally, the status quo's lasted for 40 years. There's no reason to believe it can't continue to exist. It doesn't mean it's preferable, doesn't mean that they can't change in the future, but given all of the other environmental conditions, I don't see anything changing for at least the foreseeable future, leaving us with a no-state solution. Thank you.
Well, I knew we had our work cut out for us an hour ago when we set out on the task of trying to unpack the recognition of Jerusalem and Trump's first year in office, and our panelists certainly did a fine job of that. Should we set aside a few brief minutes for those who can stay for questions, or would you prefer to just simply... Why don't we do this? Why don't we, given that we're over our time, why don't we allow those who would like to stick around and chat with our two panelists to stick around and chat, and those of you who have to get on the road to do so.